There are moments in a quiet life that arrive without warning, not with noise, not with drama, but with a stillness so unusual it stops you mid-breath. He would later struggle to explain it, not what he saw first, but what he felt. That particular sensation of being watched by something that understood exactly what it was doing. The afternoon had been ordinary in every way that matters to a man who values ordinary afternoons. A low fire, the slow, comfortable smell of meat over open flame. The kind of day that asks nothing of you and gives back just enough. Warmth, solitude, the soft ambient sound of wind moving through the tree line at the edge of his property. He wasn't looking for anything. He wasn't expecting anything. He was just there, tending the grill, alone with his thoughts, the way a man sometimes needs to be. That's when the feeling came. It wasn't alarm. It was closer to awareness, a quiet shift in the atmosphere, like the air pressure changing before weather rolls in. He looked up from the fire without knowing why, scanned the yard, nothing obvious, just the familiar scatter of grass and shadow and the thick tree line standing where it always stood, dark and dense at the far edge. He turned back to the grill, adjusted the heat, let another minute pass. And then he looked again. This time he saw it, movement, low to the ground, slow and controlled, the way only a creature completely comfortable in its own body moves, not sneaking, not fleeing, simply choosing each step with a kind of quiet authority. Something was at the tree line. Something was watching him. He went still. The animal stepped forward, not rushing, not startled by his attention. It moved into the light the way a held breath finally releases, gradually, deliberately, as if it had already made up its mind and was simply allowing him time to catch up. And when it cleared the shadow of the trees and he could finally see it fully, he felt the recognition land somewhere deep in his chest before his mind had even formed the words. A Pallas's cat. He had seen photographs, maybe a documentary, years ago, but nothing that had prepared him for the reality of one standing 40 feet away in his backyard, looking directly at him. The fur was extraordinary, dense and long and layered in a way that seemed almost impossible, like something built for a harsher world than this one. The face was flat and broad, framed by that thick ruff of fur, and the eyes were pale and wide-set and ancient-looking in a way that made you feel, irrationally, that they had been watching the world far longer than you had. She was not what most people picture when they think of a wild cat. She wasn't sleek or fast-looking. She was compact and low and built for patience, for stillness, for surviving in places that would break most living things. Pallas's cats don't live in places like this. They live in the cold open steppe, in rocky terrain, in the kind of silence that stretches for miles. They are among the most elusive wild felids on Earth, not because they are rare in the way of fantasy, but because they have spent thousands of years perfecting the art of not being seen. And yet here she was, seen. He didn't move, neither did she. For a long moment they simply existed in that space together, a man by a fire, an animal at the edge of the trees, both of them suspended in something that didn't quite have a name yet. Then he noticed the rest, her body, the way she carried herself, or rather the way she seemed to work slightly harder to carry herself than her careful movements led on. There was a heaviness to her that wasn't slowness, not exactly. Her belly was full and low. Her frame, already compact, seemed to hold something more. She wasn't injured, she wasn't sick, she was pregnant. Visibly, unmistakably pregnant, in the late and serious way of a creature whose body has redirected everything it has toward the life it is preparing to bring into the world. And she was thin beneath all that fur. He could see it now that he was looking, the slight hollowness along her ribs, the way her coat, magnificent as it was, couldn't entirely hide the effort her body was making just to keep moving. She had been feeding herself and her unborn kits for weeks, maybe longer, through cold and terrain and the relentless demands of survival. And somewhere along that journey, something had shifted. The hunting had become harder, the distances between meals had stretched, and somehow, through instinct or desperation or something more deliberate than either, she had followed a scent or a sound or some quiet animal logic he would never fully understand, and she had walked out of the wilderness and into the edge of his world. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't panicked. She stood on the grass in the afternoon light with her wide, pale eyes steady and her breathing slow and her enormous, improbable fur ruffling slightly in the breeze, and she looked at him the way a creature looks at something it has already decided about. She had come here, She had come to him, and now she was waiting to see what he would do with that. Every reasonable part of him knew better. Wild animals are unpredictable on a calm day. During pregnancy, that unpredictability compounds into something else entirely, something driven by instinct older than reason, older than caution. She could turn, she could lunge, not out of malice, but out of the deep biological imperative that tells a mother-to-be that the world is a threat until proven otherwise. He knew this, and yet he couldn't stop looking at her. She hadn't moved, hadn't hissed or flattened her ears or dropped into the low, coiled posture of an animal preparing to defend itself. She simply stood there in the open afternoon light, watching him with those pale, steady eyes, patient in a way that felt almost deliberate, like she had done the risk calculation long before he had, and had already arrived at her answer. He looked down at the grill, then back at her. The food was right there, simple, real, more than he needed for himself. He made the decision quietly, the way most honest decisions get made, not with fanfare, not after long deliberation, but in one small, certain movement. He reached down, took a piece of meat from the grill, and crouched slowly the way you move around something you respect, lowering himself to her level without thinking about why that felt important. He placed the food on the ground, then he stood and stepped back. She didn't rush, she didn't flinch at the movement or retreat toward the trees. She dropped her gaze to the food, then raised it back to him, one more long look, as if confirming something, and then she moved, slow and low and careful, each paw placed with that same deliberate grace. She closed the distance between herself and the food in her own time, on her own terms, and then she ate. He watched her and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The moment didn't need narration or interpretation, it only needed witnessing. She ate with the focused, efficient hunger of a creature that had been carrying too much for too long, and somewhere in the simple act of watching her, he felt something shift quietly in his chest. She needed this, not in a small way, not as a convenience. She needed this, and she had known, in whatever way wild things know things, that he was the one to come to. He stayed still. The fire crackled low behind him. The trees stood dark and patient at the edge of everything. And for a moment the distance between wild and human collapsed into something neither of them had words for. She didn't leave. That was the thing he hadn't expected. He had assumed, reasonably, logically, that once the hunger was met she would go. That she would take what she came for and dissolve back into the tree line the way wild things do, leaving behind nothing but the faint impression of something extraordinary that had briefly, accidentally intersected with the ordinary. But she stayed. She finished eating and she simply stayed. Settled herself a few feet from where the food had been, folded her weight down with the careful deliberateness of a heavily pregnant animal managing her own comfort, and looked at him, not warily, not defensively, with something that sat closer to quiet acknowledgement, the way one living creature sometimes looks at another when the pretense between them has been dropped. He didn't speak, he barely moved. He understood instinctively, the way you understand certain things not from knowledge but from something older, that this moment was fragile in the best possible sense, not fragile like it might break, fragile like it was rare, like it was the kind of thing that only exists if you're careful enough not to disturb it. So he was careful. He lowered himself slowly onto the ground nearby, not crowding her, not performing anything, just reducing his height, his presence, his impact on her space. And she watched him do it with those wide, pale eyes that missed nothing, and she did not move away. The distance between them was small now, a few feet, close enough that he could see the full texture of that remarkable fur, the slow rise and fall of her breathing, the slight tension she still carried even in stillness, the constant low-level vigilance of a wild animal that never fully powers down, never fully surrenders its awareness even in rest. But beneath that vigilance something else was visible. She was tired, genuinely, deeply tired in the way of a body that has been working without rest towards something enormous, and in choosing to stay, in choosing to lower herself to the ground in the presence of a human and simply breathe, she had extended something that her species almost never extends. Trust. Not blind trust, not the trust of an animal that doesn't know better, but the considered, deliberate trust of a creature that had weighed the situation with senses far sharper than his, had measured him in ways he would never fully understand, and had decided, quietly, completely, that he was safe, at her most vulnerable moment in her entire life. She had chosen him, and he sat with that truth in the afternoon quiet, the fire burning low behind him, and felt the full weight of what it meant. He gave her more. It wasn't a decision he overthought. It came from the same quiet place the first piece of food had come from, something simple and human and honest. She had stayed, she had trusted, and the least he could do was make sure that trust had been worth something real. He went back to the grill, gathered what was left, brought it carefully, slowly, and set it down closer than before. She watched him approach without retreating, just that steady, ancient gaze tracking his movement, measuring him, confirming what she had already decided. She ate again, more settled this time. Less of the sharp, urgent hunger from before, and more of something that looked, quietly, like relief. He stood back and watched, and didn't say a word, because this wasn't about him anymore. If it ever had been, this was about her. About the weight she was carrying, the lives folded inside her that the world didn't know about yet. Every meal she couldn't find was a cost paid not just by her body but by theirs. Every mile she had covered on tired legs through cold terrain had been traveled for them, not for herself. She was, in the most complete and uncomplicating sense of the word, a mother doing what mothers do, enduring everything so that something fragile could survive. And she had walked out of the wilderness to give those lives a better chance. He understood that now, fully. When she finally finished, she didn't move immediately. She sat in the low afternoon light with her extraordinary fur ruffled softly by the breeze, and she was still, the particular stillness of a creature that is for one small moment, not in survival mode, not calculating the next move, just present, just resting inside a moment that had been, against all odds, safe. Then she rose, slowly, carefully, with that same deliberate grace that had marked every movement since she first stepped out of the trees. She turned toward the wood line, took a few steps, and then she paused. She looked back at him. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was long and steady and full of something that didn't require translation, an acknowledgement, a closing of a circle that neither of them had known was open. Then she turned away, and the trees folded around her, and she was gone, as quietly and completely as if she had never been there at all. But she had been there, and out in the wild, where trust is the rarest currency of all, a creature that extends it to no one had extended it to him. And because of that single, unrepeatable afternoon, 2 lives, maybe more, had a better chance at the world. Some moments don't need to last to matter. This one would stay with him forever. Farchi stay with him forever.